Hello class, welcome to week 7 of Python. So in this week there was actually a change in the homework assignments. Originally we had lab activity 4.3 function arguments, and we had module lab assessment 4 app investment return on investment function. So if you guys go to Blackboard, you'll notice that, let me just change the Blackboard. So if you guys go to Blackboard, course content, all the way down to week 7, and go to homework assignments, you'll notice that we still have lab activity 4.3 function arguments, but the module was switched out with lab activity 4.4 using Lambda functions. I just felt like this was more appropriate for kind of like the time investment that I want you guys to invest for this week. The other lab is a bit more involved and more time consuming, so that's why I kind of took it out for now, and maybe we get back to that for like a exam in the future. Maybe not, we'll see. But for now, just do these two assignments and do your readings. Um, and if you guys are confused, so the first one is pretty basic. 4.3, we're going to walk through it. 4.4, using Lambda functions. So if you guys go to week 7 and then actually have the PowerPoint open right here, so it's the very last slide in the PowerPoint. It gives you the syntax of how to create a Lambda function. It kind of gives you a breakdown of the different parts. So the argument list part of the syntax, so this part right here is gonna consist of whatever arguments we're going to include, and they're separated with commas. The expression part is using those same arguments that we listed here, but doing some type of arithmetic expression with them. And then the final thing is you could assign the lambda function to a variable. So like this entire thing can be equated to a variable so that it's saved somewhere. And that's kind of how you create a lambda function. The syntax is very different from a regular function. So if you guys are confused, just go to this final slide. I will include a separate video on the content from this week. I'm not sure if I cover Lambda functions specifically, but if you guys are confused, it's very basic. It's also in the readings, the chapter readings. So let me go to back to MindTap. So in MindTap, let's go to Lab Activity 4.3 function arguments. I'll open that up. So here we're just creating a function called skip integers. So the basic syntax of a function is it always starts with def, followed by the name of the function. In this case, they give us the name, it's skip integers. We always include the parentheses, and within the parentheses, we pass our parameters. So in this case, they say with a variable number of arguments, so they don't really give us the number of parameters we want to include. So in those cases where we're going to pass some positional arguments. So positional arguments just mean like this argument is the first argument, this is the second, this is the third, this is the fourth. That's how they're passed through the parameter. If we just kind of want to do a catch-all parameter, we would use the star, and then we would follow it with whatever we want to name our parameter. In this case, I'm just going to name it args for arguments. And so this, even though it looks like I'm just passing one parameter and we have 4 arguments, it's going to catch all 4 of the arguments. It's just like a shorthand of doing so. And then we end it with a colon. So now when I press enter, it indents for me. That just means that whatever I write right here, where my cursor is currently sitting, is going to belong to the function of skip integers. So within this function, they want us to create a for loop to iterate over the arguments. So basic syntax of a for loop is it always starts with for, followed by the dummy variable. It could be whatever you want to call it. In this case, I'm just going to call it argument, followed by in. This is always consistent. And then the final thing will be whatever list we're traversing through. In this case, we're traversing through every single argument that is passed through our parameters. And my parameter name is args, so that's what I'm going to write here. Don't forget the colon. When I press enter, it indents for me again. This just means that whatever I write here belongs to the for loop specifically. So within my for loop, I am going to create a if statement because in number 3, they say they want me to check to see whether the value passed is of integer type. If it is, so this is the keyword, if. The moment I see that, I already know it's an if statement because it's either going to meet the condition or it's going to maybe give an else statement. If not an else statement, then it's just going to check that condition. So I already know I'm going to create an if statement, so I'm going to type if. And because they want me to check to see if a value is of integer type, I'm going to use the type function. So type just checks to see whether a value is a certain data type. It could be an integer, it could be Boolean, it could be a string. It'll check that. So if type, and then what I'm going to put inside of it is my dummy variable of argument. Why am I putting argument? Because that argument represents each of these arguments that's going to be passed through this parameter. So instead of putting args here, I'm going to put argument because argument represents each specific argument that I'm passing through, not the whole list, each individual argument. It's going to go one by one to check. And now I'm going to equate this to int because I want to see is type argument is what this is essentially saying is if 3 equals int, data type int, then continue. Continue just means skip. Don't print it out, just skip it. Move on to the next argument. And so right below you saw that I pressed backspace to unindent. The reason I want to unindent is because I no longer want this print statement to belong to continue. This print statement is the final number 4, which is print the arguments. So here I just want to print argument. Remember, argument, not args, because argument is going to represent if this if statement is not true. So like say if 5.2 equals int, it doesn't. So this continue never executes and it moves on to this print. This print statement belongs to the for loop. It no longer belongs to the if statement. If I wanted it to belong to the if statement, I would indent. At the same level continues at, but because I don't want it to do that, I want it to belong to the for statement, I unindent so that it's at the same level as if, which belongs to for. So indentation is very important for Python to understand certain lines of code. And so now if I do python 3 main.py, it's going to print out 5.2 value, the string of value, and then 6.0, because all of those are not whole numbers. They have either like a decimal value or they're a string. None of those are integer data types. The only integer data type was 3. And if you notice, 3 is not printed out. Because when this if statement ran, it said, okay, is 3 equal to int? Yes. So it just passed through it. It continued. And that's all this lab is. So if I press this, it should give me full marks. Great. So that's this lab. So the next lab is lab activity 4.4, which is actually even easier. So if I quickly go back to Blackboard and I open up the functions PDF, the PowerPoint, and go all the way to the bottom. So lambda function, so this is the syntax we want to follow. Lambda, which is a consistent keyword that we're always going to include whenever we call a lambda function, so it's always going to be lambda, followed by an argument list, colon, and then the mathematical expression that uses those arguments. So let's go back to the actual lab. Okay, so this we don't touch. We want to write our code up here. So create a lambda function that takes in here we have our kind of like arguments of, I, I would call them parameters, but yeah, they're more parameters than arguments because these are technically the arguments. These are the parameters, so that's my fault. So create a lambda function. So I'm going to write lambda because I already know I need to do that. So lambda, and then we're going to follow that with a comma, and then, or not a comma, we're going to follow it with number, comma, power. So lambda is the keyword that stays the same, and then it's followed by the parameters. In this case, they gave us parameter names. The first one is number, the next one is power, and because we have two parameters, instead of putting them in parentheses, we just write them out and separate them with a comma. So at the very end, once we're done with our parameters, we do use the colon, and then they want us to return the value of number. So number, this is where we put our mathematical equation. This is like the part of the syntax where we're going to use those parameters and do some mathematical expression with them. So they want us to do number raised to the power. So when we raise the power to something, we use the double multiplication symbol, and then we're raising it to the power of power. So we just write power, because remember, on this side of the syntax, we have to use all the parameters that we listed on the left side of the colon. So if we use number and power, on the right side we have to use number and power again. We just have to use some type of mathematical operator. In this case, we use the double multiplication, which represents taking a number to a power of something. So that's number one. Number two, they want us to assign to a variable called exponential. So if we're going to assign this whole line to a variable, we put the variable at the very beginning. So I'm going to write exponential equals, and then what we just wrote. And then they say print the exponential variable using the numerical values 2 and 6. They already wrote this for us, so we're just printing the lambda function, or not the lambda function exists inside of this variable exponential. So we're printing the variable, but we're passing two arguments, because remember, we have two parameters in the lambda function. So we have number and power, and so 2 is going to replace number, 6 is going to replace power, so really the lambda function is doing 2 to the power of 6. So that's what it's going to print out. So when I do python 3 main.py, it's going to give me 64. And when I click on this, it should give me the full marks. And that's it. Very simple program for like a lab activity 4.4. All you have to do is understand the Lambda function syntax, which I included in the PowerPoint. I'll go back to the PowerPoint. Just follow the syntax. The only change between this and the other thing is that I am equating this entire Lambda function to a variable. I equated it to the variable of exponential. If you're going to do that, you have to put the variable in front of this lambda function. Don't put it behind, put it in front. So put the variable name equals and then the lambda function, and that's it. So relatively simple homework assignments for week 7. Do look out for the kind of like lesson overview video, which is going to be separate from this. So that's going to kind of go over the entirety of everything that's included in the PowerPoint. So all of the components that pertain to functions I will go over. And I'll briefly go over Lambda functions, but we kind of went over it here. And that's it. So next week we will not have any homework assignments or videos because next week is spring break. So I will see you guys the week after, where we will continue with whatever topic we're going to go over in that week. But as always, if you guys have questions, you guys can reach out via email. Even next week I will respond to your emails, so don't worry about that. If you guys have questions or concerns, reach out to me. And that's week 7. So I'll see you guys the week after spring break.